Indonesia's latest political crisis didn't erupt from mass protests or street demonstrations, as many might expect. Instead, it quietly began within the walls of the nation's parliament, far from the daily struggles of ordinary citizens. In a move that would soon spark outrage across the country, lawmakers gathered to debate and ultimately approve a controversial new benefit for themselves, a substantial housing allowance that would soon become the talk of the nation. The decision was swift. With little public consultation or transparency, members of parliament voted to grant themselves a hefty monthly housing stipend, raising eyebrows both inside and outside the government. Critics quickly pointed out the lack of debate and the speed with which the measure was passed, fueling suspicions about the lawmakers' true motivations. Each of the 580 House members would now receive 50 million rupiah per month, about $3,000. To put that in perspective, this sum is nearly 10 times the minimum wage in Jakarta, Indonesia's bustling capital, where millions struggle to make ends meet. For many, this figure was staggering, especially when compared to the average worker's pay. The disparity becomes even more glaring when you look beyond the capital. In Indonesia's poorer regions, where factory workers, farmers, and street vendors often earn a fraction of what their urban counterparts make, the allowance is up to 20 times higher than the average monthly wage. For these communities, the news felt like a slap in the face, a reminder of just how distant their lives are from those of the political elite. The total cost of this new perk? An eye-watering 1.7 trillion rupiah, or roughly $106 million. This comes at a time when most Indonesians earn less than $200 a month and are already struggling with rising food prices, fuel costs, and stagnant wages. For many families, every rupiah counts, and the idea of politicians awarding themselves such a large sum felt deeply unfair. Defenders of the allowance argued that it was only temporary, a necessary measure due to the loss of official housing for lawmakers. They insisted that the funds were needed to ensure parliamentarians could continue their work without disruption. Some officials even held press conferences to justify the decision, claiming it was in the best interest of effective governance. But for millions of Indonesians facing economic hardship, these explanations rang hollow. Many saw the move as tone-deaf, especially as families across the country tightened their belts and worried about how to pay for basic necessities. The contrast between the struggles of ordinary people and the privileges of politicians had never felt more stark. The housing allowance quickly became a glaring symbol of the widening gap between Indonesia's political elite and its people. Images of luxury cars parked outside parliament and aerial shots showing slums next to upscale neighborhoods only fueled public anger. The sense of injustice was palpable, as many wondered how their leaders could be so out of touch. Outrage erupted almost overnight. Social media was flooded with posts condemning the decision, and protesters began to gather outside government buildings. Many Indonesians viewed the allowance as a profound betrayal of public trust, a sign that their leaders were more interested in personal gain than serving the people. As anger spread, the stage was set for a nationwide backlash. The controversy over the housing allowance would soon become a rallying point for those demanding greater accountability and fairness from Indonesia's leaders. Online outrage quickly spilled into the streets, uniting students, workers, and ordinary citizens in protest. Jakarta became the epicenter, with thousands rallying outside parliament, demanding the repeal of the housing allowance. Creative banners and chants mocked lawmakers' greed, while social media amplified the movement nationwide. Major cities across Indonesia, Medan, Solo, Yogyakarta, Makassar, saw large-scale demonstrations, all echoing the same demand: scrap the allowance and listen to the people. Hashtags trended for days, turning a policy dispute into a national referendum on political accountability. The protests' rapid spread showed just how deeply the issue resonated. The government could no longer ignore the anger in the streets. As protests grew, tensions escalated into violence in several cities. In Jakarta, clashes broke out between protesters and riot police, with tear gas and water cannons deployed. The situation turned tragic in Makassar, where protesters set fire to the local parliament building, resulting in 3 deaths. Similar confrontations erupted from Sumatra to Papua, leading to injuries and hundreds of arrests, many of them minors. The violence gave authorities a pretext for harsher crackdowns, overshadowing the movement's original message of economic justice. The crisis deepened, with both sides hardening their positions. The images of burning buildings and street battles dominated headlines. The stakes for Indonesia's future had never been higher. Amid the turmoil, one tragedy galvanized the nation: the death of Afan Kurniawan, a 21-year-old motorcycle taxi driver. Afan, not a protester but a bystander, was killed by a police vehicle during a demonstration. His story struck a chord with millions, turning him into a symbol of the ordinary Indonesian caught in the crossfire. Protesters rallied around his name, demanding justice and accountability for police violence. President Prabowo visited Afan's family, promising an investigation, a rare gesture acknowledging the public's grief and anger. Afan's death transformed the protests, shifting the focus from policy to a demand for justice and restraint. The movement's resolve only grew stronger. As Indonesia's crisis unfolded, the streets of Jakarta and other major cities were filled with protesters demanding change. The unrest was palpable, with citizens voicing their frustrations over economic hardships, political corruption, and social injustices. Russian state media injected a new narrative, one that sought to shift the focus away from these domestic issues. Blaming the unrest on foreign interference, Sputnik claimed, without evidence, that external forces were behind the chaos. Specifically, they pointed fingers at billionaire George Soros, alleging he was orchestrating the protests, a familiar conspiracy theory used to discredit grassroots movements around the world. This narrative was not new. It had been used time and again to undermine legitimate movements by suggesting they were puppets of powerful outsiders. The story echoed global trends, with similar accusations surfacing in the US and elsewhere, where protests were also blamed on foreign meddling. These claims served to delegitimize the protesters' grievances and paint them as mere pawns in a larger geopolitical game. This narrative aimed to delegitimize the protesters and distract from the real domestic causes of the unrest, such as economic inequality and political corruption. For the government, it offered a convenient scapegoat, a way to deflect criticism and avoid addressing the root causes of the discontent. For the government, it offered a convenient scapegoat. For protesters, it was a malicious attempt to undermine their cause and discredit their legitimate demands. For protesters, it was a malicious attempt to undermine their cause. The spread of such disinformation threatened to muddy the waters of Indonesia's struggle for justice and truth. Disinformation now threatened to muddy the waters of Indonesia's struggle for justice. The battle was no longer just in the streets, but over the truth itself. The battle was no longer just in the streets, where protesters clashed with police and voiced their demands for change, but over the truth itself. Journalists and fact-checkers now had the added responsibility of sifting through the disinformation to uncover the real story behind the protests. While protests raged, Indonesia's press faced its own assault. In March, Magazine received a severed pig's head and headless rats, grisly warnings to stop their critical reporting. The threats followed public rhetoric from President Prabowo, condemning foreign-funded media, fueling suspicion and intimidation. Demonstrators accused of being a foreign agent, echoing the same conspiracy theories spread by Russian media. Press freedom groups condemned the attacks, calling for investigations and protection for journalists. With its history of challenging power, now faced a chilling echo of Indonesia's authoritarian past. The crackdown on media signaled a dangerous turn, threatening the very foundation of Indonesia's democracy. The fight for truth had become as urgent as the fight for justice. The Soros conspiracy theory was pure disinformation. No evidence, no credible sources, just a convenient distraction. The real cause of the protests was clear lawmakers' self-enrichment at the public's expense. Student groups and labor unions led the demonstrations, not foreign agents. The Open Society Foundations denied any involvement, reiterating their mission to support democracy, not fund unrest. Such conspiracy theories serve to confuse, divide, and let leaders evade responsibility. In times of crisis, critical thinking and fact-checking are essential. The truth pointed to a homegrown movement demanding economic justice. The government's response was twofold: crack down on protests while projecting empathy. Police used force and mass arrests, while President Prabowo made high-profile gestures like visiting Afan's family and promising investigations. Yet, officials refused to back down on the housing allowance, citing practical needs. This hardened the perception that the elite were out of touch and unwilling to listen. The government's ambiguous stance on foreign interference further muddied the waters, fueling division. The balancing act between control and compassion left the crisis unresolved. Indonesia's leaders now faced a test of their commitment to democracy. As of September 2025, Indonesia stands at a crossroads, its future uncertain and its people restless. The protests that began months ago have not faded. Instead, they have grown in size and intensity, echoing through the streets of Jakarta and beyond. The controversial housing allowance, a symbol of government excess for many, remains a flashpoint, fueling public anger and frustration. As the government's legitimacy is increasingly called into question, security forces have tightened their grip on the capital. Barricades and checkpoints have become a daily reality, and the sense of unease is palpable among both officials and ordinary citizens. The crisis has exposed deep rifts between leaders and citizens, especially the youth, who have emerged as the driving force behind the movement. Their demands for transparency, justice, and a voice in shaping their country's future have resonated across generations. Many see this as a defining moment for Indonesia's democracy. Attacks on the press and the spread of disinformation threaten Indonesia's hard-won democratic gains since the fall of Suharto. Journalists face intimidation, and misinformation campaigns muddy the waters, making it harder for citizens to discern truth from propaganda. The government's next steps will determine whether Indonesia moves toward greater repression or democratic renewal. Officials have promised dialogue, but many remain skeptical, fearing that promises of reform may be little more than empty words. The world is watching closely, as international media spotlight the unfolding events. Global leaders and human rights organizations have urged Indonesia's leaders to respect civil liberties and listen to the voices of their people. At the heart of the protests is a call to protect the freedoms that underpin democracy: freedom of speech, assembly, and the right to dissent. These are the values that millions of Indonesians have fought for over decades. The outcome of this crisis will shape not just Indonesia's future, but also the hopes and aspirations of its youth, who are determined to build a more just and open society. The stakes are high, not only for Indonesia, but for the entire region. As the largest democracy in Southeast Asia, Indonesia's path will influence its neighbors and the broader democratic trajectory of ASEAN. The choice is clear: retreat into authoritarianism and risk losing decades of progress, or embrace the difficult work of reform, accountability, and genuine dialogue. In the days ahead, Indonesia's leaders and citizens alike must decide whether to stand together for democracy or allow fear and division to shape their destiny.